Here's my biggest piece of advice, okay? Don't prioritize sex. And no one's going to understand what I mean by that. It's not about prioritizing sex. It's about prioritizing the ingredients of great sex.
Hello and welcome back to Honey, We Need a Chat. We are just introducing a very exciting guest episode today. If you can see the video, you'll see my beautiful arm candy hanging around in the background. If you can't see the video, it won't make any sense. But we forgot to do the introduction. So we're just quickly doing that at Blair's desk, hence the different setup. This week, we have an incredible conversation with Sheila and Keith Gregoire from over in Canada. They are authors and public speakers in the sphere of relationships and especially in intimacy. So this conversation is all about intimacy, physical intimacy in a relationship. And there is so much gold that we're really, really excited to bring this conversation to you. These guys are incredible wealths of knowledge. They have a lot of experience in this space. They've done a lot of research, a lot of work working with couples in terms of really developing and healing their sex life and finding a beautiful balance there. So we are excited to bring this conversation to you guys, and we think it's going to be really helpful. We hope this is really encouraging, and we can't wait to hear how you find this conversation with Sheila and Keith. Thanks, guys.
Honey, we need to chat.
Well, welcome to Honey, We Need to Chat. We are really excited to talk to our guests this morning. We're talking to Sheila and Keith Gregoire over from Canada. You guys are actually our second Canadian guests. Is that right?
Yeah.
We just spoke to our first international guest at all in the whole podcast last week, and he's also from Canada. So there you go. Canada.
There's a theme.
Yeah,
There's
we're making a connection here.
Okay, now I have to ask who it was.
His name was Bryce, and he's made an incredible relationship game called Uncover Me. And it's really unique, and he's done such a great job. And it's just basically a game that helps people break down into really foundational interesting conversations as a couple, but it's not open-ended questions. It's really specific.
Yep.
Really
oh gosh, I gotta take a look at it now.
Absolutely check it out. Yeah, because we can't get it over here. We've got it. They sent us a free option, but we can't get it in Australia very easily. But you guys could.
Sorry, Aussies.
So hopefully eventually. So Uncover Me is what the game is called. But yeah, we're loving the Canadian guests that we're having on the podcast. And I'm really excited personally because I've actually spoken with Sheila and Keith previously on a different podcast that I was hosting with a good friend of mine. And just the chat was so incredible. And I remember getting to the end of it being like, I could talk to these people for so long because they're just a wealth of knowledge. Sheila and Keith have worked in the relationship sphere for a number of years. Sheila is an author. She's been a public speaker, and Keith has been joining her in that as well. He's also a pediatrician, which is super handy. We have 4 children, and pediatricians have been very helpful.
Very involved part of our life.
And they bring a really beautiful focus in relationships and to communication and intimacy specifically. And we're really excited to dive into some of that today with them. So thank you so much for taking the time. The complicated time zone issues that we have to have this chat with us today. We're really excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Well, we might dive right in and talk a little bit about your, I guess, focus of relationships. I remember reading very early on, I think it was even just before we got married, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. Which is one of Sheila's books, and you've just remastered that. Is that right? In recent years?
Yes. We wrote it. I completely rewrote it. Yeah.
There you go. So I've got to check out the new one. But I just remember loving the fresh perspective of intimacy and working on kind of breaking down some of the things that women might struggle with, but couples might struggle with in terms of coming into a relationship together in an intimate sphere. So right off the bat, what are some of the things from your experiences working with couples that are the biggest misconceptions that people might have when they're entering into a romantic physical relationship with each other?
Okay, well, here's my biggest piece of advice, okay? Don't prioritize sex.
Yeah.
All right.
And no one's going to understand what I mean by that. But the thing is, it's not about prioritizing sex. It's about prioritizing the ingredients of great sex. Because everyone's always telling you to prioritize sex. And what do they mean by that? Well, I don't know. I guess we're supposed to have sex 3 times a week or 4 times a week or something. But what is sex?
Yeah.
Right? Seriously, if I were to ask you what is sex,
That's one of the things that we really start with is how do you define sex? Because how you define it is going to really have a big impact on what it looks like in your relationship. And like Sheila says, if someone stuck a microphone in your face and said, "Hey, give me the definition of sex," assuming you didn't run away because that's very creepy. Most of the time you'd say something along the lines of, tab A goes in slot B.
Yeah.
We start talking about sexual intercourse specifically. And when you define sex as that one act, it becomes very male centric. Yeah. And it doesn't really encapsulate the whole experience.
Yeah. Like she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. She could be in emotional turmoil, or she could even be in physical pain, and that would still count as having sex. And so one of the problems is when we see the issue with sex being how often do we have intercourse, all we're really asking is how often does he have a climax?
Yeah.
Right? And so what if instead we were to focus on what makes great sex? Because if you focus on those things, frequency tends to take care of itself. And so I just think we're looking at the wrong metric a lot of times.
And as a doctor, it's kind of like, you're treating a symptom rather than the disease. If you're not having sex, what's the reason? We talk particularly people who've been traumatized by bad ideas about sex, and they're resisting it for a reason because it's been a bad experience for them. And to say to those people, well, you should just have it more. That's not the right answer.
Not the fix.
When you have a symptom, you need to look at what's the cause of that symptom. So if sex isn't what we want it to be in our relationship right now, we need to have some curiosity and say, what are the elements of our relationship as a whole that are contributing to the current state, and how do we address those?
I mean, I think you've stumped me already. I'm just sitting here. I'm like, man, that is such good words, just in terms of just that self-reflection, right? So as the male in our relationship, it's so true, and just out of all transparency, Amy and I have had these conversations recently in our relationship about sex and what it means to each of us and how we prioritize it differently and the struggles that we have to get into that mood and all that different stuff. So it's hearing you say that is really a nice shock, I think, and just a really nice lens to equip me with to see sex and what I'm trying to achieve and the importance of it and everything else like that, which is really, really great, which I really appreciate. When you share this with couples, what sort of responses do you get with that sort of lens that you bring out?
A lot of fear. I think there's a lot of fear because if we let go of the idea that you have to have sex and that we have to pressure people to have sex frequently, then she's never going to want it. So, and there's so many assumptions in that statement because first of all, the assumption is that he wants it more than she does. That is not true in all marriages. We've surveyed about 40,000 people now over all of our surveys. Our biggest one was of 20,000 women for our book, The Great Sex Rescue. But here, I'm going to list 5 things, okay? So get ready. I'm going to list 5 things. But what we found is that when she frequently reaches orgasm during a sexual encounter, when there's high marital satisfaction and when mental load is shared, when they feel emotionally close during sex, so she's not feeling used, when there's no porn use in the marriage, and when there's no sexual dysfunction, then frequency takes care of itself. And I think people are really scared to let go of that idea that we need to tell people that they have to have intercourse no matter what, and instead say, well, let's focus on the ingredients because they're like, well, then she's not going to have sex. But that's the assumption there is that she's not sexual.
Yeah.
Women are sexual. You just have to give them something to want.
Yeah.
So make sure it feels good for her. Make sure it's a good experience.
And again, I just love that. I'm someone that loves just again, it's all about that lens. I love using that word of a lens of how do I see a situation, because again, what you've just done there is sort of paint that picture of cool, there are ingredients. So for guys, a lot of times we look at the situation on our sex life or whatever else, and it's just well, she doesn't want it. She doesn't want this. She doesn't want that. And it's well, I don't know what to do. I'll give her a massage. I'll do the dishes. I'll do these things that we know of, but we don't fully understand the insides and the inner workings of a female as well. And again, we get a lot of write-ins from males. And this is a big thing that we hear is that I just want to know what is going in the mind of my partner. I want to know how they think. I want to know how they operate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's good to have, in some ways it takes the pressure off both sides when you're like, you don't have to be focusing on how regularly you're having sex and rather focus on these things. It takes pressure off both sides because then you do have a practical kind of formula in some ways, although it's probably not the same for everybody, but formula you can step through and be like, okay, if something's not working, let's look at these 5 different areas and let's look at where maybe something's
let me tell you the story of Kay, and we talked about her in our book, The Great Sex Rescue. So Kay, they had a really good sex life when they first got married. And then they went on to have a bunch of kids. And with each child, she had postpartum depression a little bit more. And so by the time her third child rolled around, she was quite out of commission for quite a while. And when she started to come back around, she started initiating sex every 72 hours because she felt like that's what you're supposed to do. And it was 2 years after the birth of her last child, and she still hadn't reached orgasm again, even though she had regularly been orgasming before. But she still initiated sex, and she hated it. And she was just growing really resentful of her husband because, this was doing nothing for her. And then finally her husband sat her down and said, like, what's going on? Like, it doesn't seem like you're into it. And she said, well, no, I just feel like I have to do it. And he said, no, wait, hold on, back up the truck. Like, I don't want you ever to do anything that you don't want to do. And so from now on, let's just initiate if someone actually wants it. But if you don't want it, you just tell me and we'll stop. Like, even if we're in the middle of something, you just tell me and I will roll over and I will go to sleep and it will not be an issue. And over the next few months, he proved that to her. So if they, a couple of times they're in the middle of it and she's like, nope, this isn't doing anything. I'm not going to get there tonight. And he would just stop. And she found that her ability to respond came back. She finally became orgasmic again. And so now they've settled into a new routine, she told me, where they have sex about every 72 hours. So, it's still the same frequency, but it's different now because she doesn't feel the pressure and because it's really based on both of them enjoying things, not just doing it out of duty.
That's huge.
From and I'm sure it's in your books, but from your experience and your research, what has been the sort of more underlining things for couples that are struggling in this area to either communicate about it or even just to follow through with, I guess, understanding that for each other, where each other at?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I would just say that, the biggest thing to talk about before anything else is probably the orgasm gap.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say.
And our survey was specifically of religious women, evangelical women. And so we had an orgasm rate of 47 points, by which I mean that 95% of men almost always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter compared to just 48% of women. Wow. So that's a lot of women who aren't having very much fun. Now, when you look at other surveys that aren't as much in the religious context, there's still an orgasm gap. It's not quite as large, but you're still looking at about a 35 point orgasm gap.
And then I think the thing that happens is this gets translated as, well, women just don't want sex. Men do. They're not as interested, and women don't.
Yeah.
Well, it's women want good sex.
Yeah.
They don't want that kind of sex.
Non-orgasmic, disconnected, not emotionally close sex. No, they're not interested in that. And frankly, as guys, we should ask the question, well, why are we into that? Because that's a whole other podcast, probably.
Yeah.
But I'm always amazed at the lack of curiosity. I want her to want sex more. Well, but she's not enjoying it, and you're not doing anything different to make sure she does enjoy it. You just are now telling her she should enjoy it so that she'll want it more.
Yeah, like we asked both men and women in different surveys, does he do enough foreplay? And in marriages where she frequently reaches orgasm, over 90% of men said, yes, I do. I think it was like 98% or something. Yeah. And about 88% of women said, yes, he does. So, even when she does reach orgasm, 12% of women are still saying he could do more. He could do more. But they're giving him good marks. But when she doesn't reach orgasm, 71% of men and 52% of women still say that he does enough foreplay. And so you have to kind of ask, enough for what? Like, why are people saying it's enough if she's not having pleasure? And I think it's because a lot of women have internalized the idea that we're broken. So, if sex isn't working, it's because I'm not sexual. And he kind of figures, well, yeah, like I'm trying, but she just doesn't do anything for her.
And a lot of that comes back to what we started at the very beginning. What is sex? I mean, even the use of the word foreplay, it's not a word that I particularly like, because the implication is this is the stuff you do before the real stuff.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that penetrative sexual intercourse is a really good way biologically to stimulate a man, but it's not the optimal way to stimulate most women.
Yeah.
And so if we really want to make sex great, we need to think of it as the whole event and not have such a focused, priority on that one part of it. And if we took all the pressure off, we just said, we're just going to enjoy each other and it goes where it goes, I think a lot more women would be able to relax and actually enjoy that. And of course, it would be a great experience for both of them.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, because you don't orgasm as easily as I do in this particular sex act, you're not sexual and I am.
Yeah.
Which when we put it in those words, you realize how ridiculous it is to say that. But frankly, that's what society kind of pictures, like the movies.
Yeah.
You see what happens in movies. They start, and then bang, and then it's all happened and everyone's amazing.
Yeah. And everybody enjoys it and it's perfect. Yeah.
That's not reality. That's not the way that,
I've sometimes wondered what it would be like if for exercise sake, men just had to enjoy sex without orgasming for a while. Like if it would change their approach to it, because I feel like if the tables were turned and the woman every time, it was pretty much guaranteed every time you're going to have an orgasm, you're going to enjoy it. And then they had to navigate, but my partner's not really enjoying it that much. I feel like if you're having that pleasure all the time, it'd be really hard. You have to be really intentional to take your mind out of that and be like, oh, actually, maybe they're not enjoying it as much as me. And I've sometimes thought, how interesting, for experiment's sake, would it be to see how it would change things if for a month or something like that, every time you did it, the guy didn't get to have an orgasm, but the woman had to. And that was how you went about it, and see how that would change people's approach.
I think that would actually that would definitely give you a whole other appreciation of the process. You know what I mean? And that was one question that I had for you. So again, as a guy and knowing how a lot of guys are in this scenario, in this area of their relationship, we can be very selfish in the bedroom. We can be very selfish in terms of, and not necessarily intentionally, but just in terms of, again, that understanding of our partner and what their needs are to have that same experience that we have. It's a lot easier for us, I feel. And so to hear all of this, like, oh man, this is fantastic. Again, it's helping me with that lens. But I can also see the other side for a lot of guys where this could be quite overwhelming information in terms of, man, I'm one of those guys that, may not be pleasing my partner as much as she would like me to, or whatever else. So hearing all of that could be quite overwhelming. What would you say to that guy? Like, where's the hope in that situation?
Yeah. The thing is, you can decide to do things differently, right? You can turn the tables right now.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to keep going the way it's going, but it does take risk. Because if you start addressing her needs as well, it might mean that you don't get sex as often as you were before, because she's like, no, I matter now. And it might take some time, to figure things out. But isn't that worth it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think the other element of it too is, what are we looking for in sex? Because another thing, you were talking a lot about the difference between men and women and how men and women approach sex. And one of the things that a lot of times we're socialized to think is that the physical side of sex is for men and the emotional side of sex is for women. And so, I've even heard people say that men just want quickies and they don't want emotional connection. They just want the release. And women don't really care about that. They just want to cuddle and be close, And I think that's not I think a healthy view realizes that sex is a physical and emotional experience for both people. And so, if I'm in a relationship with this person and I'm finding this something that's easy and I'm enjoying it, but she's not, like, emotionally that should matter to me.
Yeah.
So, as hard as it is to say, if we're in the middle of things and you want to stop, I'm going to honor you and let you stop and still hold you and tell you I love you. And I'm going to go have a cold shower or do whatever I need to do, right? Because I care about you. I think showing that you really respect and want this to be a good experience for them. It's not just lips. It's not just you're not just saying it. You actually believe it. Like a lot of guys are in the mindset you were saying earlier. You know, like I wash the dishes, I do these things because they're trying to earn sex from their wives, as opposed to seeing sex as something that flows naturally out of a healthy relationship we're both building on. And I think having that mind shift as a guy, instead of seeing sex as a transaction, seeing it as a way of connecting. Because then if we're not connecting emotionally, if we're just connecting physically, then we're not really fully connecting. And we need to work on that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part of the urgency that a lot of men feel. And it also is a lot of the fear because, and this isn't guys' fault, okay? And this is not saying that women are better, believe me. But in our society, it generally is that little girls are taught to pay attention to emotions and little boys are not. So little girls are allowed to express emotions. Little boys, the only emotion you're allowed to express is anger. And so a lot of boys grow up and they don't know how to recognize what they're feeling, how to talk with emotional language. They don't know how to be vulnerable. So you could be feeling weird about something that happened at work, but you don't know how to talk to your wife about it because you don't want to seem insecure. You don't want her to think badly of you. And you've never been able to admit any weakness because that was always laughed at in your family or whatever. Yeah. And women could go through this as well. It just, men go through it a lot more than women do, which is really unfortunate. And so because of that, often the only way that men truly have to connect is through sex because they don't know how to be vulnerable in an emotional way. And so because of that, we all need intimacy, right? We were all created with this deep, abiding need for intimacy. But if you can't express that emotionally, then often the only way that you can express it is sexually. And so if a woman says she doesn't want sex and a guy really has a difficult time being emotionally vulnerable, then the only way that he feels connected is through sex. So when she doesn't want it, he's like, I have absolutely no way of getting my intimacy needs met now. And that really leaves him stranded. But what if instead we really worked at how to help more men become comfortable being vulnerable with their wives, you know, like telling them what you're scared about, what you're hoping for, what you're thinking about, what you're feeling today. Because if you can connect emotionally, then that intense need for sex it goes away to a certain extent. Like it's not as overwhelming because quite often what happens is that men especially can feel like I need sex as a way to connect because I have a very difficult time connecting in any other way. And that's part of the panic.
Just don't have the tools. Right?
Yeah. And it's not, again, this is not like, it's not that men are not capable of it. It's just that in our society, we don't socialize men to learn how to. And a lot of women struggle with this as well, you know? So it's like the more that we can teach people how to be emotionally vulnerable, the less sex seems like a rejection if your spouse doesn't want it. And the less that hurts you. And the more you're actually able to want sex. Like when you're able to be emotionally vulnerable with each other, that actually often fuels libido.
Absolutely.
Have you guys worked in this space much, like working with men to do those things, to work through those things and learn these things?
We've certainly talked about it a lot.
Yeah. I would just say that what we've identified with our research is that men who are able to connect to these emotional levels do have better sex lives with their wives. But in terms of the guys who find this a hard thing to do and need to learn those skill sets, we're not counselors. We're sort of researchers and writers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But we have a number of people that we put them in contact with who have really good books and other resources in those areas.
So you're talking about, helping men get into that space of, understanding with their emotions and how to communicate those emotions. But I also see the other side too with women of, because the man struggles to share emotions or could struggle to share those emotions, sometimes maybe the woman can also feel like she doesn't know how to communicate to him because he doesn't respond in a specific way as well. So their relationship, might be in this space where they haven't, communication hasn't been a strong point of theirs. In that sense, how would you guys encourage people that might be in that scenario to start this conversation?
Yeah. Okay, we have a really simple exercise that I really encourage people to do every day. It is such a simple thing, okay? But every day, maybe after dinner when you're sitting enjoying a cup of tea, maybe before you're going to bed, share 2 emotional moments with your spouse. The moment where you were the most in the groove today, like you were doing what you were put on earth to do, you were succeeding, it was amazing. And then the moment when you felt the most defeated. Like, this is a slog. I hate this. I can't do this. This is awful. Because often what we do at the end of the day is we ask the question, so what did you do today? Right? And what's the answer to that? Well, I had 6 client meetings. I went to the bank at lunch. I went grocery shopping after. Like, it doesn't let you in on where your spouse actually is emotionally. So just ask them to check in. Do that simple check-in. What are 2 moments? And we started doing that when Keith was working about an hour away from home. And sometimes he'd have to stay overnight. And so we didn't see each other as often as we used to. But I'm not a big talker on the phone. Like, I don't like talking on the phone. So we would do this because it was a lot quicker, but we still kept up with each other. And I started to realize that every night when I shared my most defeated moment, it was the same thing. It was whenever I checked my email. And I realized, wow, I really hate my email. And so I hired someone to check my email and my life got a lot better. So you can learn stuff about yourself too. That's the great thing.
Yeah.
Because we don't reflect ourselves on that most of the time. Yeah. It's not just our partner doesn't know. We half the time just go through life without ever thinking about it.
And that's the beauty of being vulnerable with each other and being able to be open and honest with each other, right? But you have to build a place that you can of trust. Like, there has to be an undergirding of trust. If I'm going to truly open up and be vulnerable to you and share my fears with you, I need to know you're not going to freak out.
Yeah.
That we're going to be able to, we're going to still be a team. We're going to still work through these things together, and we're going to be okay. Right. If I keep facade up and you're happy, and then I let it down and you start to look nervous, that I'm going to just go back into my little fortress, right?
Yep.
We have to actually be able to be a safe place for our person that we love to actually be honest with us. And that can be hard too. So
yeah, we talk a lot about this in our new marriage book that's coming out in March. It's called The Marriage You Want. And
awesome.
We surveyed a bunch of couples and really dug deep on how emotional connection matters, and looked at couples who did it well and what the key ingredients are. But just that checking in with each other is so key, because a lot of people, their marriages exist without ever really sharing their feelings. You might know what your spouse thinks about politics. You might be talking all the time about kids' dentist appointments and doctor's appointments, and maybe we need to go on a weight loss program or whatever, but you haven't actually talked about feelings. And that's when marriages get really stale, because you don't actually know each other.
Yeah. And I just want to say as well to our listeners at the moment, the guys that are listening in, I just want to speak to you for just a couple of minutes. This is, again, we have these moments where we hear something and it's great, but it can be quite overwhelming, because it's that when we get put on that spot of like, well, I'm not used to this, and now my partner's asked me this question, and now I'm like, I'm not rehearsed, I'm not prepared. And what I want to encourage you, think about this during the day. If you can't do it in the morning, find that time where it gives you that prep time to think through. Think about it during the day. You're gonna have this question brought up at the end of every day, and think about that, prepare for that. This is something that's extremely important for your relationship, to be able to go vulnerable, to be able to be emotional, to be able to create that safe space. And it really is, if you can't go there yourself, it's going to be very hard for your partner to go there as well. So if this is a priority for you in your relationship, to grow in communication, to grow in intimacy, to grow in connectedness, prioritize that, man. Really create that space and be prepared to go on that journey with your partner.
Yeah. Something we've tackled the topic, and when I say tackled, I mean we scratched the surface because it's so big, of mental load on this podcast before.
Right.
And it's something that I have regular conversations with people, just workshopping. I feel like it's just such a big monster that just sits there unaddressed most of the time in relationships. And I was thinking, I really struggle to bring things up. And that's been one of the things I've had to work on in our marriage, when I know that it might not be easy to hear, or it might not be fun to hear, or I'm asking something of Blair that will be more work, or whatever it might be. And so I think as a woman, if you're listening to a podcast like this, or you're reading a book, and then you're like, oh, this is what I need more of from my partner. It can be a really hard thing, regardless of if it's intimacy or you need more stuff done around the house, whatever it is. It can be a really hard thing to ask the person you love to do more for you. Do you have any advice on how to approach that conversation?
Yeah. Well, can I share with you a stat that's in our marriage book? Yeah. So this isn't even out yet. So you guys get the preview.
Okay.
Yay. Awesome. So we scored marriage satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 100. And most people actually report being quite happy. And so most scores are kind of within like the 70 to 90 range. So they're not that wide. Anyway, when there's money problems in the marriage, that affects the marriage by about 5. So you're going to see a 5-point drop on a scale of 100.
Yeah.
When you go from having sex like once a month to a couple of times a week, you improve the marriage by about 10 points on a scale of 1 to 100. Okay. So that's how much that affects. Now
we got to say something. Those are associated. We're not saying if you have sex more, you'll have a better marriage.
Yes. It's just associated.
It's associated.
There's the causation versus correlation thing that
just
you're going on.
Just got to say that.
Yes. But when we look at housework and owning housework, when you move from doing 50% to doing 100%, you see a 30-point drop.
Wow.
So people think sex and money are the big issues in marriage.
No.
Wow.
And actually, it's housework.
Yeah. And this is a big thing. And this is one of the things that as guys, we've just got to get over it and look at the data and do a reality check and say, truth is truth, facts are facts. And the issue is this. There's really good studies to show that over time, people's enjoyment of marriage declines. And for women, it declines a whole lot more than for men in general.
No.
And they've done studies, they've done time studies. What are you spending your time doing as a couple? And what they found is that over time, women are doing more and more and more work, and men are doing more and more resting.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
And then what happens is this goes on for 10 years. It gets a little bit annoying. It goes on for 15 years. It's getting really annoying. And then all of a sudden she left me for no good reason.
Yeah. No good reason.
Well, you know what I mean? Like, this is what happens, right?
And we want to say this isn't every couple. Like I think in our survey, half of couples are doing great.
Yes.
So it's not every couple, but it is a lot. And if it's you, it matters.
Yeah. And my point is that if you don't address this early on, you're not going to see it right away, but you can only handle unfairness and it's something that's really not a just division of how we do things for so long. And then it's just going to be too much. And then you can't rebuild, guys, because you've taken advantage of a situation for a really, really long time. You can't just suddenly say sorry now. Yeah. So my challenge to guys is be a partner from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not I help my wife with the housework.
Yeah.
My wife and I have a house. And so we do work in it.
Yeah.
Right? Now you don't always do the same thing. And some of you may do more of the actual traditional housework than the other person because one person's making more income or whatever. But the point is that you need to decide as a team what's fair and what you're both going to contribute. And you need to both be contributors.
Yeah. So I have literally had this conversation about 5 times in the last 2 months with friends whose partners just do not step up in the house. And we have on the podcast, we like to give a really well-rounded approach to the topics. And I recognize that a number of these people also don't know how to let their partner own different parts of whatever it is that they're navigating. So there is a balance there. It's not a matter of like, he should know that I need him to do all those stuff without me ever mentioning it. And then also without me even giving him the opportunity to do it. Or I like break him down when he does try. There is a balance there.
There's also the other side too, where it's like, all right, dude, like, do you need her to tell you?
Well, you live in a house and there's rubbish that needs to be taken out.
Yeah,
you live in a house and you've got kids that wake up at nighttime.
Yeah.
There's stuff that should be just a little bit more obvious than it is. But in terms of wanting to be a team and fully agree with what you've said, working on it now so that it's not 10 years down the track when there's a massive divide between you guys. It's a massive problem to overcome. How does a wife or any partner, if they're experiencing this kind of thing, how do you approach asking someone to do more? Like, how do you approach that when they're not an invested party in that point?
Well, I think you just got to ask.
Yeah.
And you've just got to say, I am not willing to live with this. If it continues in this way, you know, it is not going to continue in this way. I am not going to keep doing everything for everybody because that is not sustainable. And we just need to be really firm about that. And there's a lot of different ways that you can figure out how to divide things up. I really like what Eve Rodsky said in her book, Fair Play. I think she's got a lot of really good ideas of just owning an entire task. So, because a lot of guys are like, yeah, I'll do it. Just give me a list, right? Just give me a list and I'll work through the list. But the problem is, as soon as you say that, she still has to be the one.
It's still the mental load.
Who is figuring out what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, who is keeping track of when's the last time we changed the furnace filter, when does the dry cleaning need to be picked up, what snack do we need to take to the kids' sports practice, whatever. So if you can just each own different spheres, so maybe he does the entire sports practice. So he manages the calendar, he manages the fundraisers that there always are, he manages whatever snacks. If practice uniforms have to be cleaned, he cleans them. He does the carpooling. He does everything. So she never does that.
Thing. Yeah.
Right. Because a lot of times we think, well, taking Johnny to soccer practice just means putting Johnny in the car and driving him. But it's more than that.
Absolutely.
You know, so maybe he owns all of that, and maybe he owns like all the laundry or something. Well, you know, she does the dishes or cooks or whatever, but just own different spheres so that she doesn't need to give you a list, because she has the ability to just completely forget about that. You know? She doesn't have to think about soccer at all.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that we found is there are a lot of studies that show that men who do more work around the house tend to have better sex lives with their partners. But it's the exact opposite of the I'm doing the dishes so I'll get something
to have sex.
It's the exact opposite of that. It's they're engaged partners who are committed to the relationship, and guess what? Their wives find that sexy, right? Because that's like having a partner is sexy. It really is, even for guys too, right? You know, and I think that's so important. One of the things I would think is to start with these particular women, if they're talking with their partner, is to say, do we not agree that we should both work on this relationship and we should both have the same amount of downtime? Because if we've had dinner that I've made and then I'm cleaning up the dishes and putting everything in the dishwasher and wiping the tables off while you go watch TV, you know, that's not fair. Like, I'm still working and you're on relax mode now. Right. So, you know, you're not going to always have like you might both work out of the home. Only one of you may work out of the home. There's all kinds of different ways to navigate it. Who's doing what? But at the end of the day, we both should have the same amount of time to relax. And if you've got a lot of time to relax and I don't, that's not fair, and that's not going to bode well for our relationship long term. And I think sometimes guys need a little bit of a shakeup to realize that. And as I said earlier, better now than years from now.
And sometimes it's flipped. You know, we found that there are men who do the vast majority of stuff. I think it's like 5 times more often it's women, but there are men who do as well. And so whichever it is in your relationship, the point is that we all need to be contributing partners.
I hear one thing a bit where, you know, guys might say, but you've been at home all day with the kids. Like, you know, I've been at work all day. I stayed home for a year with the kids, by the way, while Amy worked. That is hard work, man. It was such an eye-opener for me, and something I'm so grateful for, because it was just like, that is not rest at all. It was harder than my actual job.
It was a good activity, though, because it was hard for me to be working and then come home. Or we were working from home, but come into the house space face. And it was a good activity, actually, a good exercise to like see each other's perspective on it. But yeah, it is. There's a lot of things that play into, and the family of origin, that, you know, how you've been raised and what you've experienced is a huge one, I'm sure, that plays into what you expect. But I think what we say on this podcast all the time is to be curious and to spend time asking the questions and exploring what people's expectations are and that kind of thing. And I think if you're having those expectations, you're living out your family culture without having the conversation, then that's probably the first spot to be like, oh, hang on, we haven't actually spoken about this. So what's playing out is probably not the most constructive and healthy way if we haven't even gotten on the same page. So a question about coming back to intimacy specifically then, we, just to get a little bit personal for a second, when we first got married, we went through a time where my drive was actually higher than Blair's at the beginning. And for a number of reasons, Blair's was lower. And but
we can be full transparent. I had a pornography addiction, when we got married and stuff, which really played into that side of stuff.
Especially as Christians coming into marriage, it was an interesting mix. And also he was working a really labor intensive and early morning job. So we just had a lot of things, including new marriage, that we were trying to navigate. In that time, I felt very rejected, and my initiation and my approach to sex really got shut down. And now we're on the flip side. We're having this conversation this week where Blair's, his sex drive is a lot higher, and mine, because we've got 4 children and I've had that experience, has just gone like, I really struggle. And especially right now we're moving house. My brain is just not even there at all. It's like completely off the radar. And so Blair's like, it's kind of starting to feel rejection as well on his end. And I was like, well, I don't think that I've really worked through the rejection that I felt at the beginning. So now I've just shut that part down. Now he's experiencing rejection because I've shut that part down. So it's a big, complicated relationship, which I think a lot of couples would have factors that are complicated like this that play into it. How do you go about, you know, and we've got the benefit of being on the same page. We want to work on this, and we're very open to communication and working on things. So that's beautiful that we're already at that stage. But how do you go about healing when you've been, it's one thing to start fresh in a new relationship on the same page, wanting to have a really, you know, holistic sex life. But when you've had experiences where you have had hurt, how do you go about healing that side of it to come together in a more strong way when it's like deep hurt that you don't even really understand yourself?
Now, I always say that you can't forgive and heal from what you can't name. And so, you know, to fully heal from something, you have to be able to name what it was and all the effects that it had. There's a concept that we find in the Bible called lament, which we don't really practice as a society anymore. No. And I think we need to get back to it because it was very therapeutic. Yeah. And the ancients and many other cultures in the world today, non-Western cultures, actually practice lament really well. But it's just when you name the things that happened to you. And you let yourself be sad about them for a time. You're allowed to sit in the sadness and name it, because sometimes we can't move on from it unless we let ourselves process it.
Yeah.
And so just letting yourself take some time and say, okay, this is actually what I felt. Because often we're running away from those feelings. We don't want to let ourselves feel them because we're afraid, well, you know, what's going to happen if I let myself feel them? You know, is the marriage at risk? Am I going to get into a depression? And if you really fear that you will, then please do this exercise with a licensed counselor. But sometimes you just got, and I'm not saying do it for months, but just sometimes you might just need to take a weekend or something and write it all out. Write yourself a letter, write him a letter, write God a letter, whatever. Just say, this is what I felt, you know, and then talk through it, process through it, and then say, how is this affecting me now? And where do I want to be? Where do I want to go? What do I want to do with this? You know, and then talk through some of the forgiveness parts. You know, I want to forgive you, but what I need to see is this. Like, here's why I'm still having trouble trusting. Let's talk that through. And these are all big conversations. They're hard conversations. Yeah. And it's not necessarily a simple fix, but you can't heal from something unless you really dig down deep and let yourself feel it.
I love that. The lament, even the word itself is so dramatic and like it's like a physical feeling when you say it, lament. But it's
it's not a word that you'll hear.
No, it's not. It's not part of our culture at all. It is very much like push it away. Like either be bitter and end up living a bitter life because you haven't dealt with it, or just pretend it didn't happen. So I love that. I love that perspective, and I think that's a really practical, tactic to do. I'm going to try and lament. Well, we might start to wrap this chat up, even though I don't want to, because it's been amazing. For a while. But one last question for you guys. If you were to talk to yourselves at the very beginning of your relationship, what is one piece of advice that you'd want to give to younger Sheila and Keith?
You want to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, again, I could talk for an hour on this one now. But the big thing for me, what you're talking about, it goes back to what you were talking about just a second ago about the feelings of rejection. Because, early in our marriage, my drive was the high one. And I also very much internalized it and felt rejected. And what I wish I had done, I wish I was mature enough at that time to have said, why is this such a need for me? Like she's tired and she doesn't want to have sex. Why do I experience that as rejection? Like what's going on in me? And am I willing to see because honestly, I would feel like I was less of a man, or that I was like, all these kind of things, and our masculinity and all of these things are wrapped up in this whole thing. And asking the questions, well, why is that? Like, why do I see it that way? And why can't I just realize she's tired?
Yeah.
And in a non-judgmental way, just kind of actually do the work on my inside rather than kind of becoming pressure or becoming guilt or becoming but I washed the dishes or the whatever. I wish I'd gotten to where we are a lot sooner if someone had told me that when I was younger.
Yeah, I would just say one of the things our daughter Rebecca says, and she's the co-author on The Great Sex Rescue and our book, She Deserves Better. We do a lot of research together. I loved her attitude towards her first year of marriage, which was everything that bothered her, she made a big issue out of, which goes against a lot of the advice that we hear, right? We hear don't sweat the small stuff and everything. Yeah. But she and her husband were both like, no, if there is something that I don't want to live with for the next 50 years, I need to deal with it now. And they had a rough first year where they dealt with everything.
Yeah.
Like, I am not doing the dishes every night. Like, we are going to talk about this. Whereas, he would be like, no, you're not going to go running to your mother and talking to her. Like, they had a bunch of stuff. They both did. But they dealt with it all. Yeah. And I see a lot of people not having those deep conversations early on and just trying to skirt along the surface. And they were like, nope, we're going to deal with this now, because what we deal with now will set the stage for what our marriage is going to be like in the next 25, 30, 40 years. I love that.
I think that might be my new advice to people that are getting married. As long as you can deal with it in a constructive way, wanting the best for your partner. Yeah. And it's not just to make a big deal of it because you want to make a big deal of something. I think that is
making
really
a big
helpful.
Deal doesn't mean blowing something out of proportion. It means
highlighting it,
deciding if this is something you can honestly let slide or not. And if you can't, just be honest that this is something we need to work on.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good. I love that. Well, how can people find you? What can they be looking for online to connect with you guys?
I'm at bearmarriage.com. So that's BARE, bearmarriage.com, and all our social media is there. And you can find our 2 books. Great Sex Rescue is our big one on sex, which has a ton of charts and stats. It's really fun. And then our new book, The Marriage You Want, is out in March, and it has even more charts and stats.
That's awesome.
And really, really fun. So.
Awesome.
And that's all on the website. They can find those books on the website.
Yeah, at bearmarriage.com, and our podcast is there as well.
So. Awesome.
Fantastic.
Well, we will be checking that out, and you guys should be too. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. We really appreciate it.
If you have not signed up to our website, go do that now, because we're going to send this out to you guys as well, so you can find the books and the links and that.
Send you the links
straight away, so you don't have to do the searching yourself. So sign up there or check out our socials, and we'll get all that information to you.
Tag you guys up as well. Awesome. Thank you so much, guys, all the way from Canada. We really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
That's great.